Copper Ridge, Montana Territory, autumn 1883. When 24-year-old Emma Caldwell stepped off the stagecoach holding a 3-month-old baby she wouldn't explain, the town of Copper Ridge whispered their assumptions. But ranch owner Daniel Garrett saw something different, a woman protecting something precious at terrible cost. While others demanded answers, he simply asked what the child's name was, then disappeared into his workshop. By morning, a hand-carved cradle sat on her doorstep, and Emma understood that some men measure character not by explanations, but by the courage to keep going when the world turns its back. Chapter 1. Arrival Without Answers. The stagecoach rattled into Copper Ridge on October 12, 1883, carrying dust, mail, and one passenger who would change everything. Emma Caldwell descended the steps with careful precision, one hand gripping the rail, while the other cradled a bundle wrapped in faded calico. The afternoon sun caught the edge of a tiny fist, revealing what she carried wasn't luggage. The baby made no sound. Emma held the child close against her chest, protective and purposeful, as if silence might shield them both from judgment. Her traveling dress bore the creases of a week's journey, and her dark hair had escaped its pins hours ago, but her shoulders remained straight despite obvious exhaustion. Copper Ridge consisted of 2 dusty streets, a handful of buildings, and a population that noticed everything. Within minutes, curtains twitched in windows. Women gathered near the general store, their voices carrying across the square with practiced curiosity disguised as concern. A young woman alone with an infant and no wedding ring invited speculation that required no evidence. Emma ignored the stares with deliberate focus. She collected her single trunk from the coach driver and asked directions to the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher, who ran the establishment, stood in the doorway with arms crossed and lips pressed thin. The woman's assessment was immediate and damning. No husband, no explanation, no room available despite the obvious vacancy sign hanging crooked in the window. 3 more establishments delivered the same message with varying degrees of politeness. The dressmaker claimed her spare room was promised a family. The hotel proprietor invented a plumbing disaster requiring immediate repairs. Even the church rectory, which had sheltered countless travelers, suddenly had no space for a woman whose circumstances raised questions she refused to answer. Emma stood in the center of town as afternoon shadows lengthened, holding a baby who had begun to whimper with hunger. Her options narrowed with each rejection until none remained. The next stagecoach wouldn't arrive for 3 days, and the prairie nights grew cold enough to kill in October. She sat on the bench outside the closed mercantile, rocking the baby with mechanical gentleness while exhaustion pressed against her bones. The infant needed feeding, changing warmth. Emma had prepared for rejection, but not for this complete absence of mercy. A wagon rolled to a stop nearby. The man who climbed down stood tall, somewhere past 30, with sun-weathered skin and hands scarred from years of ranch work. He wore simple clothing, worn denim, a cotton shirt, boots that had walked through countless seasons. His face carried the particular stillness that comes from spending more time with animals and land than with people. He approached with unhurried steps and removed his hat, revealing hair the color of prairie grass in late summer. His eyes assessed the situation without judgment. A tired woman, a hungry baby, and a town that had already made its decision. His question came simple and direct. He asked if she needed help. Emma's throat tightened with the unexpected kindness, but she managed to nod. He introduced himself as Daniel Garrett, owner of the Broken Creek Ranch 5 miles north. Without asking about circumstances or demanding explanations, he offered his barn loft until she could make other arrangements. The relief nearly broke her composure entirely. Emma whispered her gratitude while standing on trembling legs. Daniel loaded her trunk into the wagon without comment, then helped her climb up with the same careful courtesy he might show any person deserving of basic human decency. The ride progressed in contemplative quiet. Daniel didn't press for conversation or explanations. Instead, he pointed out landmarks, the creek that ran year-round, the ridge where antelope gathered at dawn, the stand of cottonwoods that marked his property line. His voice carried the steady calm of someone comfortable with silence. The baby stirred against Emma's chest, making small sounds of distress. Without breaking stride, Daniel reached beneath the wagon seat and produced a canteen. The water was cool and clean, tasting of minerals and mountain snow. Emma dampened her finger and let the baby suck, providing temporary comfort until proper feeding became possible. The ranch appeared as daylight began its final surrender. The main house stood solid and well-maintained, built from logs that had weathered decades of Montana storms. A barn rose behind it, sturdy and practical. Chickens scattered at their approach while a dog emerged from beneath the porch, tail wagging cautiously. Daniel secured the wagon and led Emma to the barn. The loft space had been cleared and swept clean, with fresh hay spread across the floor and covered with canvas tarps. A lantern hung from a central beam, and blankets lay folded in the corner. Preparations made before he'd even left town, suggesting he'd anticipated exactly this outcome. He carried her trunk up the ladder with efficient strength, then paused at the top. His next question came quietly, without expectation or demand. He asked the baby's name. Emma hesitated, then answered with equal simplicity, Grace. 3 months old, she added, though he hadn't asked for details. Daniel nodded once, as if this information completed some internal assessment. He told Emma there was a pump behind the barn and a privy near the tree line. She could take meals at the house if she wished, or he could bring food to the barn if she preferred privacy. The choice remained entirely hers. Then he descended the ladder and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Emma alone with her daughter and the first true shelter they'd known in weeks. She settled Grace into a nest of blankets and let tears fall silently while the baby finally slept. Through the loft's small window, she watched lamplight appear in the main house. Somewhere in that warm glow, a man who had asked no questions was likely eating a solitary meal, unaware that his simple kindness had saved 2 lives that desperately needed saving. Chapter 2. The Cradle Builder. Morning arrived with the sound of hammering. Emma woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until Grace's whimper reminded her of everything. Through the loft window, dawn painted the sky in shades of copper and rose while the rhythmic strike of hammer against wood echoed from somewhere nearby. She descended the ladder carefully, carrying Grace wrapped snugly against the October chill. The pump behind the barn provided icy water for washing, and Emma cleaned them both with efficient speed before the cold became unbearable. Grace tolerated the process with only mild protest, her blue eyes tracking her mother's face with that intense infant focus that sees everything and understands nothing yet. The hammering continued from Daniel's workshop, a lean-to structure attached to the barn's eastern side. Emma approached hesitantly, uncertain about intruding, but drawn by curiosity and something else, a need to understand the man who had offered shelter without asking why it was needed. The workshop smelled of fresh-cut wood and linseed oil. Daniel stood at a workbench surrounded by tools hung with meticulous organization. Wood shavings curled across the floor like fallen leaves. In his hands, something was taking shape, curved rails, smooth spindles, a rocking base that moved with gentle precision. He looked up at her approach, nodded a greeting, then returned his attention to the work. Emma watched in silence as his hands moved with practiced skill, shaping wood into something both functional and beautiful. Each joint fitted perfectly, each surface sanded smooth enough that no splinter could threaten delicate skin. She realized what he was building before he spoke. The cradle took form beneath his hands like something inevitable, as if the wood itself wanted to become this particular thing. Daniel tested the rocker's motion, adjusted the angle, tested again until the movement satisfied whatever standard he maintained. Emma's voice cracked when she tried to thank him. Daniel glanced up, his expression unchanged, and stated simply that every baby needed somewhere safe to sleep. He asked if she preferred the cradle in the loft, or if she'd be more comfortable in the house's spare room, where the stove's warmth could reach during cold nights. The offer caught her unprepared. Moving into the house meant proximity, interaction, the possibility of questions she still couldn't answer. But Grace made small sounds of discomfort, and Emma recognized the symptoms of a chest cold developing. The barn's drafty loft, however temporarily adequate for adults, posed real danger for an infant whose lungs were still learning their work. She accepted with quiet gratitude, and Daniel nodded as if this decision required no discussion. He finished the cradle by mid-morning, carrying it to the house's spare room with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window facing east toward the rising sun. Daniel placed the cradle beside the bed where Emma could reach it easily during night wakings. Then he showed her the house's layout: the kitchen with its cast-iron stove, the pantry stocked with basics, the sitting room where a stone fireplace provided central warmth. His explanations came practical and straightforward, without ceremony or expectation. He lived alone, he explained, after his wife had died 3 years prior from complications following childbirth. The baby hadn't survived either. He spoke these facts without emotion, as if describing weather or crop yields, but Emma noticed how his hands clenched briefly before relaxing again. The house bore traces of feminine presence long departed. Curtains sewn with careful stitches, preserves lined neatly on pantry shelves with dates written in faded ink, a quilt folded across the sitting room chair with patterns that spoke of patient hours. Daniel had maintained everything exactly as left, creating a museum of life that once was. Emma settled into the spare room with relief that bordered on disbelief. She fed Grace, changed her, then wrapped her in fresh blankets while the baby fought against sleep with that particular stubbornness newborns possess. The cradle rocked with perfect smoothness, and eventually Grace surrendered to exhaustion. That evening, Daniel knocked softly before entering with a tray. He prepared a simple meal: beans, cornbread, coffee, and set on the dresser without comment. Before leaving, he mentioned that if she needed anything during the night, his room was just down the hall. Then he was gone, closing the door quietly behind him. Emma ate slowly, savoring food she hadn't needed to prepare herself. Through the window, stars emerged one by one, while the prairie stretched dark and endless. Somewhere in this vast territory, people who had rejected her were sleeping comfortably, confident in their moral superiority. But here, in a stranger's house, she and Grace were safe. The cradle rocked gently beside the bed, moving with Grace's slight weight. Emma studied its construction: the smooth joints, the careful curves, the attention to every detail that might matter to a sleeping child. Daniel had built this knowing nothing about her circumstances, asking nothing about Grace's father, demanding no explanations or confessions. He had simply seen a baby who needed a safe place to sleep and had created one with his own skilled hands. The gesture spoke more than words ever could about the kind of man who measured worth not by social standing or marital status, but by the fundamental human need for shelter and kindness. Chapter 3: Silence and Understanding. 3 weeks passed with a rhythm of routine. Emma woke with Grace's first stirrings, fed her while dawn broke across the prairie, then moved through the house with quiet efficiency. She cooked meals, washed clothes, swept floors, contributing where she could without being asked, offering work in exchange for shelter. Daniel maintained respectful distance while remaining present. He worked his land from sunrise to dusk, tending cattle, mending fences, preparing for winter's inevitable arrival. But he always returned for meals, eating across from Emma with companionable silence that required no filling. They spoke in practical exchanges. He asked if she needed supplies from town. She mentioned a draft near the north window. He inquired about Grace's persistent cough. She explained her grandmother's remedy involving steam and chamomile. Conversations never ventured toward personal history or future plans, remaining safely anchored in the immediate present. The town, however, couldn't maintain such restraint. Word spread about the mysterious woman living at Broken Creek Ranch. Speculation flourished in the absence of facts. Some claimed she was a widow fleeing debts. Others suggested scandal involving a married man. A few invented elaborate stories of criminal activity or moral corruption. The first confrontation arrived with Mrs. Patterson, a rancher's wife known for both charity work and judgment delivered with equal enthusiasm. She appeared at the ranch unannounced, carrying a basket of preserves and expectations of confession. Emma met her at the door with Grace in her arms, and Mrs. Patterson's smile held sharp edges. The woman asked pointed questions disguised as concern. Where had Emma come from? Where was Grace's father? What circumstances had brought her to Montana Territory? Emma answered with polite vagueness, providing no details that might satisfy curiosity or confirm suspicions. Mrs. Patterson departed unsatisfied, her basket of preserves left on the porch as if contamination might occur through acceptance. More visitors followed. Each arrived with gifts that felt like weapons and questions that demanded answers Emma wouldn't provide. She remained courteous but unyielding, protecting her privacy like the precious commodity it had become. Some left angry, others confused, all disappointed by her refusal to perform the expected ritual of explanation and apology. Daniel observed these encounters from various distances: the barn, the corral, the field. He never intervened directly, but made his position clear through presence. After Mrs. Henshaw's particularly aggressive interrogation left Emma shaking, Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway and stated calmly that Emma was under his protection, and anyone who couldn't respect that should conduct their business elsewhere. The declaration rippled through Copper Ridge like a stone thrown into still water. Daniel Garrett was respected, a man of few words but absolute reliability. His willingness to shelter Emma without explanation forced the community to confront their own assumptions. Some softened their stance. Others hardened into permanent disapproval. Emma found herself grateful beyond words. One evening, after Grace had fallen asleep and the house settled into quiet, she attempted to thank Daniel properly. They sat in the kitchen with coffee cups between them, lamplight casting shadows on weathered walls. She tried to explain what his silence meant, how his refusal to demand her story had given her the first peace she'd known in months. But words felt inadequate, tangling in her throat until only fragments emerged. Daniel listened without interrupting, his steady gaze never wavering. When she finished, he spoke about his wife, how she died trying to give him a child, how the baby had lived only hours, how grief had taught him that some pain runs too deep for words, and the kindest thing anyone can offer is the space to heal without explanation. He needed that grace once, he said quietly, and it seemed right to offer it forward. Emma felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she'd carried so long it had become part of her structure. Daniel wasn't offering charity or demanding gratitude. He was simply existing alongside her pain with his own, creating a shared understanding that needed no confession. Winter's first snow arrived early that year, covering the prairie in white silence. Emma stood at the window, watching flakes fall, while Grace slept peacefully in her cradle. Behind her, the house creaked and settled, warm and solid against the cold. Somewhere in this unexpected shelter, she had found something rare, a man who measured worth not by explanations given, but by courage shown in continuing forward despite whatever came before. Chapter 4. When Silence Speaks Loudest. December brought the kind of cold that reshapes landscapes. Snow accumulated in drifts against the barn while wind tested every board and shingle. Daniel worked outside only when necessary, returning with ice in his beard and hands so cold Emma insisted on warming them between her own despite his protests. Grace grew stronger, her cough finally clearing after weeks of careful tending. She began to smile, her first true expressions of joy arriving like unexpected gifts. Emma recorded each milestone in her mind. The first time Grace tracked movement with her eyes, the first purposeful grasp, the first sound that resembled laughter. On Christmas Eve, Emma descended from her room to find Daniel sitting before the fireplace, whittling something small from a piece of pine. He worked with focused concentration, occasionally holding his creation up to lamplight for assessment. When Emma approached, he showed her what he'd made: a small wooden horse, perfectly sized for an infant's hand, sanded smooth, and rubbed with beeswax until it gleamed. He explained awkwardly that he didn't know what babies needed, but figured every child should have something to hold. Emma accepted the gift with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of a man who claimed to know nothing about children, yet had spent hours creating something perfect for hers. She had nothing to offer in return except gratitude and honesty. That night, with snow falling outside and firelight dancing on the walls, Emma told him everything. About the employer's son who had forced himself on her. About the pregnancy she'd hidden until hiding became impossible. About being cast out by her family, who valued reputation over their daughter's trauma. About the impossible choice between keeping Grace or giving her to strangers who would raise her without knowing where she came from. She explained why she wouldn't speak of Grace's father, because there was no father, only a violation she refused to dignify with that title. Why she'd chosen silence over explanation, because the truth would brand Grace with shame that wasn't hers to carry. Why she'd come to Montana territory, because it was far enough away to be nowhere, where maybe they could start over without history weighing them down. Daniel listened to everything without interruption, his face revealing nothing but steady attention. When she finished, exhausted and stripped bare by confession, he remained quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke words that would reshape Emma's understanding of what kindness could mean. He said that what happened to her was violence, not sin. That Grace's beginning didn't determine her worth. That some things in life were just brutally unfair, and the only decent response was to offer shelter to those surviving such storms. He'd asked no questions because he'd recognized something in Emma's eyes, the look of someone protecting something precious at terrible cost. That was enough for him. Then he added something that made Emma's breath catch. He proposed a solution so simple and profound she couldn't immediately process it. If Emma agreed, they could marry in the spring, not for romance or convenience, but to give Grace a father's legal protection and Emma the safety of a respected family name. He would ask nothing beyond companionship and shared household. Grace would be his daughter in every way that mattered, and no one would dare question circumstances that bore his name. Emma couldn't speak through the tightness in her throat. She'd expected judgment, not this. Daniel continued quietly, saying she should take time to consider. No pressure, no expectation. The offer stood regardless of her answer. But Emma knew her answer already. She'd known it somewhere deep down since the morning she'd watched him build a cradle without asking why one was needed. Since every meal he'd shared in companionable silence. Since each time he'd stood between her and judgment without making it about himself. Daniel Garrett had proven his character through consistent action, and that spoke louder than any declaration of feeling. They married in March, in a simple ceremony at the ranch with 2 witnesses from a neighboring property. Emma wore a plain dress she'd sewn herself, and Daniel placed a thin gold band on her finger with hands that trembled slightly. The vows were standard, but their meaning ran deeper than words could carry. That night, they maintained their separate rooms, honoring the agreement they'd made. But something had changed. Emma no longer felt like a guest sheltering from storm. She had become part of something permanent. A family built not on explanations or conventional beginnings, but on the radical grace of acceptance without condition. Grace grew into a happy child, calling Daniel Papa with unconscious trust. He taught her to ride before she could barely walk, showed her how to identify animal tracks, built her toys with the same careful attention he'd given to her first cradle. Anyone watching them together would see only a father devoted to his daughter, because that's exactly what he was. Years later, when Grace asked about her beginnings, Emma and Daniel told her the truth, that she was wanted, loved, and chosen every single day. That some families were born, and some were built by people brave enough to create them from nothing but courage and grace. That her father was the man who built her cradle before knowing her name, who saw a baby who needed protecting and decided that was reason enough. The cradle eventually held 3 more children, Daniel and Emma's sons, who grew up calling Grace their sister without qualification. The ranch prospered, and the family became a fixture in Copper Ridge, respected for their quiet dignity and refusal to participate in gossip or judgment. Emma kept the wooden horse Daniel had carved that first Christmas, passing it down through generations with the story of a man who measured character not by explanations, but by the strength required to continue when the world offers only condemnation. Some heroes, she would tell her grandchildren, fight battles. Others simply build cradles and ask no questions beyond, what is her name? And sometimes that quiet grace changes everything. If this story of acceptance without explanation touched you, subscribe for more tales of unexpected family and frontier grace. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next story.